Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxby. Today we are delighted to welcome the British statesman and former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Lamont. Lord Lamont, welcome to Brexit Watch.
Hi.
Now, Norman, obviously we have all been so affected by the coronavirus crisis. We heard last Tuesday that the government is beginning to ease the lockdown, which we've been living under for the last 14 weeks or so. Tell us, what has been your overall assessment of how the government here has handled the coronavirus crisis?
Well, probably doesn't look like our finest hour, but I think one ought to be careful about rushing to judgment. This is an unprecedented situation. It's very easy with hindsight to say things should have been done differently. My guess is that when all the statistics for different countries are put together, we'll find that the difference between European countries is not nearly as great as it appears today, Germany apart. But, I think, for instance, the difference between us and Italy or us and France is probably not as great as the statistics say.
And in terms of the government's response on the economic side, obviously the furlough scheme, although that is due to start to be unwound between August and October, what has been your assessment in terms of the economic response, of the response of the Treasury?
Well, I think the immediate measures that Rishi Sunak took were bold ones, imaginative ones, obviously highly expensive, but I think that was the right response, and the business interruption scheme, all the different schemes, I think that was the right response. I think the issue that has worried me has really been this issue of 2 meters versus 1.5 versus 1. And although I'm not saying, and was not saying, that the scientists should have been overruled, I was sort of puzzled, really, how the government couldn't see that it was impossible for many businesses, small businesses, businesses in the hospitality sector, to operate on the basis of 2 meters. And I still think there are people in the government who are a little unrealistic and think that social distancing somehow can be semi-permanent. Not only is it not economically viable, it's against human nature. And I think at some point we've got to face up to that reality. I stress, I'm not saying we should ignore scientists, but I think the idea that social distancing could be permanent is ridiculous.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned the 2 meters versus 1 meter. Obviously, now we've got this 1 meter plus rule, which is coming in, I believe, from Saturday, the 4th of July. So people will be able to move be 1 meter apart in pubs and bars and restaurants, but with measures, with partitions and face masks, and how well that will work remains to be seen. In terms of the consequences, let's talk about that. What do you see in the immediate term, at least, and perhaps going towards the end of the year when the furlough scheme is unwound? What do you see as some of the major economic consequences from the lockdown?
Well, I think the obvious danger is very considerable rise in unemployment. And there's an argument that goes on between people of different letters. Some say a V-shaped recovery, some say a U-shaped recovery, some say an L-shaped recovery. If you want to describe it in terms of letters, my guess is that it'll be more of a W. That is to say, we will see a rise in certain sectors. And we're already seeing this in the United States and in some parts of Europe, that some sectors are bouncing back pretty strongly. And so I think one can say for some businesses, there will be a V-shaped recovery. But I think there are whole sectors where that is not true. And those are very much obviously the hospitality sector, the tourism sector, airlines, airports, and I think many small businesses as well. You're quite right when you say that the 1 meter plus comes with lots of restrictions, and we will see very, very shortly, in a few days' time, whether that's really going to work or whether people are so put off the additional restrictions, they don't want to go to a restaurant and they don't want to have food served to them through a perspex shield. I can imagine many people not finding this very attractive. And also you've got the fact that many people are frightened, and the government's messaging in one sense has been too effective. So that's another problem. A side effect of that is that the savings ratio in all countries, including the other side of the Atlantic, has gone very sharply up. Now, that's really better off people probably not spending. Poorer people are not saving because they have to buy necessities. But for better off people, middle class people, professional people, they can't spend money. They can spend a certain amount on the internet, but big ticket items like buying a car or going on a holiday, they have deferred. So they have a lot of extra saving. One of the unknowns is, will this just be pent-up demand that will unleash itself on the economy and lead to a consumer boom, or will people still be cautious? Now, I think it will be a mixture. Different sectors of people, different sections of people will have a different response. But I don't myself think there will be a huge increase in consumer spending. But, you know, some people do think that. I think what we will see, well, I think there are several tides happening at once. One of them is going to be defaults on loans, and this is happening slowly. But I think we will see a lot of the loans that have been taken out during the COVID crisis, including some of the government-backed loans, will not be repaid. And there will be some commercial loans and some parts of government guaranteed loans that are not repaid. And this will have an effect on the economy, and it will have an effect on banks. You know, if this got really bad, we might see loans having to be written off. You know, this is a crisis very slowly coming towards us, but it will gather momentum. And that is why the central banks of the world have been intervening to buy bonds, buying corporate bonds in order to ease credit conditions for companies. I think the risk, particularly in America, where the Fed has been so active, is that by easing the conditions in the corporate bond market, they make companies borrow more. We've already, before this crisis arrived, we're a very over-borrowed economy already. I'm not talking about government borrowing, but private sector borrowing. And just helping people to borrow more may just delay the crisis rather than prevent it. So, you know, you've got all those things coming. You said, what are going to be the consequences of what happens in the next few months? I would say, rise in unemployment itself will have consequences. It will undermine confidence. It will lessen spending. Then we may have defaults on loans, which will further exacerbate the situation. So I think this is a situation which we won't get out of for quite a long time.
Norman, what you're talking about there in terms of loans defaulting, it's sort of the domino effect. You know, an economy, I don't need to tell you as a former Chancellor, economy is an interconnected spider's web. And that's true of the domestic economy, but it's also true of the world economy too. I mean, we've heard good things coming from New Zealand, that they've managed to, you know, get quite a handle on the crisis. But of course, for a country like New Zealand, unless and until their trading partners come back online, as it were, you know, their economy is going to be stuck in second gear. Even Sweden, which is often, you know, held up as an example of a country which adopted quite a laissez-faire attitude, Sweden has still had to adopt quite, you know, strong measures because all of its trading partners adopted, you know, the lockdown strategy. So maybe let's also talk about the international implications. What do you think some of the implications could be for the world economy in terms of supply chains, and perhaps to the relationship between China and the Western world?
Well, there are lots of questions there, but you're quite right to stress the international dimension of that, because that's another way in which there will be a depressing influence on the economy, that world trade is going to grow much more slowly than it has in recent years. It will still be growing just, I think. But if you take an economy like Germany, Germany is very well positioned, one might think, because it's had very little impact of the virus compared with other countries, seems to have been extremely successful in controlling it. And Germany is able to reopen large parts of its economy. But Germany is very exposed in another sense because it is very dependent on exports and it trades a lot with Asia, and Asian growth has slowed despite Asia managing to control the virus well. Trade with Asia is going to slow down quite markedly, which will slow the German economy down. And so every country, on top of the forces that are slowing them down domestically, is going to have international pressures slowing them down as well. So that's another thing to take into account. You asked about the effect on supply chains. I mean, another way of putting that is what's going to happen to globalization. And a lot of people are saying, oh, could this be the end of globalization? I don't think it'll be that. But I think you're right when you mention supply chains, that some companies, and there are companies, of course, that might be thought of by governments as being strategic or defense related, are going to look at how linked to China they are and whether it's necessary to diversify their supplies. That could be done on security grounds or it could be done on commercial grounds. But perhaps there will be some reaction against trading with China. That leads me on to a wider point. There's an enormous amount of ill will has built up recently towards China. Now, I do totally agree that China is a country that deserves quite a lot of criticism, the way it covered up part of the origins of COVID-19. And of course, it is a country to be criticized over its human rights record, its treatment of the Uyghurs and so on. But I think there are people in the United States and in the Conservative Party who seem almost eager to have a Cold War with China. And I personally think this would be extremely foolish. Yes, we have to be on our guard. We shouldn't put ourselves in danger with strategic industries with China. But I think it would be a tragedy for the world if China retreated into a sort of Maoist protectionism or went backwards. Where we have things in common with China, let's build on them. Let's have a dialogue with them. Let's talk to them. Let's trade with them. Let's try and isolate China completely from the world.
So Norman, could this be a moment to reshore and onshore critical industry while still trading with the world, while still being a global trading nation?
Well, yes, but reshoring should only really happen when it's competitive to do so. You know, I don't believe in reshoring for the sake of reshoring. You know, we can shown, and America has shown, that it can generate full employment without saying, this industry used to be here, let's have it back again. You know, if other countries are more efficient at producing things, the sensible thing is to let them produce what they produce efficiently, and we'll produce or sell the services that we're efficient at.
But if there are security implications, perhaps.
If there are security implications, it's completely different, of course.
And that could be interpreted, obviously, quite widely.
Yes, I mean, I think sometimes the United States interprets things with a security label very, very broadly when it's simply protectionism. Now,
leaving the coronavirus crisis aside, let's focus on Brexit. We are just on the verge of obviously the EU and the UK are currently in this transition negotiation period. During this period, the UK, having left the EU, is still part of the single market and customs union till the end of the year. No representation in the EU Parliament, but still having to pay into the bloc. It's sort of taxation without representation, albeit for a short period of time. We are just on the verge, just literally on the eve as we do this broadcast, of the deadline for extending the transition. That we're almost certain to see that come and go. Downing Street has been adamant throughout that that deadline will come and go. There will be no request for extension. We take them at their word. And face-to-face negotiations, I believe, are beginning between the EU and the UK, led by Michel Barnier on the European side and David Frost on the British side. What has been your overall assessment of how the transition negotiations have gone, and how do you think they will go for the rest of the year?
Well, until recently, I thought they had gone quite badly. By the word badly, I mean the likelihood of an agreement was not high. And personally, I would prefer an agreement to no deal. But recently, I've detected, perhaps because the British have insisted that there will be no extension of the transitional period, I've sensed a slight increase in the willingness of the EU to try to reach a deal. And I think it's more than 50-50 possibility of a deal. And I think the EU is keener now it has been convinced that Britain is not going to ask for an extension to the extension. It is anxious to reach a deal itself.
Do you think the fact that no extension will be requested may focus minds in Brussels?
Yes.
And thinking about that whole issue, obviously right now the UK is engaged in trade negotiations with its Anglosphere allies, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and of course Japan too. How important are those trade negotiations?
Well, they're obviously very important. I mean, one of the ironies of Brexit, history is always ironic, isn't it? But one of the ironies is this rubric under which we all march, global Britain, just at this very moment of history, as you have indicated in this conversation, globalization is under some threat. Globalization may be being reversed just at the point when we want to become more global. And trade may become a lot less free than it has been, who knows, as a result of this crisis. But that, I think, makes these negotiations more important. I think the timetable there is pretty demanding. Does look as though one will not be able to get a free trade deal with the United States by the time of the presidential election. And the Japanese government have indicated they don't think that they can sign an agreement of any depth quickly. I think there will always be, in these situations, a trade-off between how comprehensive a deal is, how deep it is, and the speed with which you do it. So Liz Truss may have a longer road ahead of her than she thought a few months ago. But these are important negotiations. Can I just make one point, though? I mean, I'm a strong believer in free trade. I do believe, however, I mean, I'm a passionate believer in free trade, but I think it is possible to exaggerate the practical impact of free trade agreements. The absence of them doesn't always prevent you from trading on certain terms. And we merely need to look at the example of Germany, which is a real global trading nation. And we talk about Britain becoming global Britain, but you know, Germany's export performance in manufactures with Asia is absolutely superb. And it's done that often without the comfort of trade agreements. So it is possible to exaggerate the importance of those.
Norman, I'd like to pick up on that. Based on what you've just said and what you said earlier about no deal, would a so-called WTO Brexit be so much of a problem? And would it be a major problem if the trade deals with the US or Japan weren't that comprehensive in the immediate term?
Well, I think we could live with a WTO deal. I would prefer not to. I'd prefer to have a deal, but I'm absolutely prepared to contemplate it, and to suggest any deal is better than no deal would be ridiculous. No, I think we could live on WTO terms. All these things will require a period of adjustment, but I'm sure we could get through it.
And obviously, one could argue that any products made in the EU are just as available in the US, they're just as available in Japan, etc., and certainly all those non-EU trading partners combined. So
yes and no. I mean, I don't know whether that's literally true. Let me again make a point that, you know, perhaps is not one that most people who support Brexit would argue, but I've never believed that what we are doing in trying to negotiate free trade agreements around the world, which I totally support, but I've never believed that these are designed to replace our trade with Europe. My own guess is that maybe after a little bump, trade with Europe will remain for the time being much where it is at present. You know, the long-term trend may continue, but I don't think Brexit by itself will immediately massively alter the direction of our trade. And I'm not looking to replace trade lost in Europe by trade elsewhere. I think we need both. Trade outside Europe is where the growth in trade is going to come, which is why the proportion with Europe will probably continue to decline. But, you know, I don't look at it as the United States replacing our trade with Europe. I look at it as both happening.
no, absolutely, and the idea.
But I think some people have a rather naive idea. We put up the drawbridge with Europe and we all just sell things to America. It won't happen.
No, and certainly that's our position too. Now, there would be those people listening to us, Norman, who would say that, well, the UK leaving the EU, Brexit taking place, especially on so-called WTO terms, there is no way that the loss of what the implications of that, there's no way we could ever compensate for that. With a trade deal, or indeed renewed ties with countries outside of the EU, including in the English-speaking world. What would you say to that?
Oh, if you're referring to the possible loss of the single market and the customs union, access to it, one of the reasons, I was about to say that I became a Eurosceptic, but I've been a Eurosceptic all my life, really. But one of the things that hardened my Euroscepticism was really during my time in the Treasury. You know, the more I looked at the statistics of trade between the EU and ourselves and the rest of the world, I was struck by the fact that countries that were not members of the EU were exploiting the single market far more than we were. And their trade with Europe was growing more than our trade with Europe and growing faster. And our share was diminishing and their share proportionately was rising. And you know, the advantage of the single market, the single regulatory area, as it really ought to be called, is that it's available to everybody. The benefits of a large area in which there are one set of rules are there for everyone, whether they're a member or not. The supposed advantage we get out of it, I suppose, is that we're part of the people who set the rules, and therefore they ought to be of advantage to us. But actually what happens is the United States comes along and it says, well, our goods will correspond to the rules just as much. It's worth our goods corresponding to the rules in order to sell them there. So there's no reason why we shouldn't do that as an outsider. But I think the advantages, both of the customs union and of the single regulatory area, the so-called single market, have been greatly exaggerated.
Now,
I mean, I mean, another illustration of that is if you take Switzerland, and you know, Switzerland is a European country. It's bang in the middle of the continent of Europe.
yeah,
It's more integrated with the EU than we are, and it's not a member of the EU.
absolutely the case. And one could perhaps argue Switzerland is about the most prosperous, business-friendly country in Western Europe as well, maybe even the Western world. And I would like to speak a little bit about the EU and Eurozone and what has happened there, hardly covered itself in glory during this crisis. Before I do, just turning back to global Britain, looking out to the world, do you see potential for a renewed ties between Britain and the Commonwealth countries, particularly the Commonwealth realms, Australia, Canada and New Zealand, but also the burgeoning emerging markets in the Commonwealth, such as India and Nigeria. What do you see as the potential there?
Well, I think countries like Australia and New Zealand are very keen to have stronger relations with Britain. I think they felt we ditched them somewhat in 1972 when we joined the EEC as it was then. I think countries like India are in a different category. I mean, India is a country I admire, I have a lot of affection for, but you've got to remember this is a growing national country that's got its own sense of nationhood is what I meant. And although I hope Britain will always have friendly ties with India, I don't think there will be quite as a result of Brexit a cementing in the way that there will be with Australia and New Zealand.
So perhaps it's the Commonwealth realm.
I mean, you know, I don't think Mr. Modi will be sitting there studying Brexit and thinking, gosh, I must get close to Britain. Mr. Modi's got other ambitions for India.
No, so it's likely to be then perhaps the Commonwealth realm countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, rather than countries like India or Pakistan, where you see stronger post-Brexit trade ties and perhaps geopolitical ties too.
Yes, yes.
Now, Norman,
I mean, when you say geopolitical ties, I mean, I am not against having security cooperation or foreign policy cooperation with the EU. It took me a little while to make up my mind before I finally decisively could not resist the temptation to campaign for leaving the EU. But one of the things that worried me a little was just foreign policy, because I do think we've had a bit of leverage in the world stage out of being members of the EU, and there's a danger that we count as less because we're not part of a bloc on our own. And I think, you know, given that we were so important to the so-called foreign policy of the EU, I think having a formal link with the EU in foreign policy is not one I would be against. I mean, I'm not in favor of foreign policy being made by committee or majority voting or anything like that. But where we have things in common with France, which I think we often do in foreign policy terms, I think acting together and operating together is something that we should be very willing and ready to do.
So do you think perhaps we could find some of that geopolitical clout in the Commonwealth, or at least the Commonwealth realms? I mean, obviously the population numbers are not as great, but these are burgeoning parts of the world, very healthy, perhaps the healthiest parts of the Western world in many respects, growing economically, growing in terms of population, huge, vast resource superpowers. So perhaps in terms of geopolitics and military interoperability, there could be an ability for the UK to cement ties with the Commonwealth countries and to essentially augment its geopolitical clout and develop greater geopolitical weight in the world.
Well, you know, I think a country doesn't just have one set of alliances, it has several. And Britain has a close relationship with the United States. It tends to back the United States on foreign policy issues. And often Australia and Britain have been the countries that have supported the United States. And I would expect that that would continue. So that's one axis. But at the same time, you know, sometimes France and Britain have had common interests and have acted together independently of the United States, sometimes not very successfully, sometimes successfully. But I think that, you know, you can operate both. All I was saying is I don't think we should turn our backs on foreign policy cooperation with Europe. You know, France is a nuclear power, a small one. We're a nuclear power, a small one. Makes sense to have a degree of coordination in our view of the world, I think.
Now let's turn to the EU and the Eurozone, Norman. It's hardly covered itself in glory, as I said, during this coronavirus crisis. We've had the Corona bonds debacle a month or so ago, when countries primarily in Southern Europe, the hard-hit countries such as Italy and Spain, were arguing for common debt issuance across the Eurozone. Something resisted in the wealthier, relatively wealthier countries in Northern Europe, including the so-called frugal four of Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Sweden. We've obviously at times had medical exports being banned between European countries. We've had borders slamming shut. We now have a proposed Franco-German 500 billion euro bailout fund, primarily composed entirely, I think, 500 billion of grants rather than loans. Germany seems to have had a bit of a conversion to the idea, 11th hour conversion, as it were, perhaps faced with growing Euroscepticism across the bloc, perhaps spooked by that, I don't know. This proposal is still being resisted, it seems, by the so-called frugal four. What has been your assessment of how the EU and Eurozone has handled the coronavirus crisis? What do you think the future holds for the bloc?
Well, that's very difficult to say. I mean, I've been involved in this question for a very long time because I was the negotiator at Maastricht when the euro was set up, and I've always been of the belief that the euro was a mistake and that the euro was a political project designed to lead to political union, to which I was wholly opposed. And when I negotiated along with John Major our opt-out from the euro, I regarded it as a means of saying no, not a means of saying maybe. And thankfully now it's absolutely certain that we will never join the euro, I think. I think the paradox at the heart of Europe is that Germany needs the European Union. Germany needs the identity of Europe. Germany cannot and does not want to assert itself too much, but it can do things in the name of Europe. At the same time, although Germany is afraid a little of its own nationalism, although it is a little bit afraid of its own nationalism, it also doesn't want to surrender its identity entirely to a European identity. Germany, I think in its heart of hearts, does not really want a federal Europe at all. They're quite happy to talk about moving towards it. They're quite happy to be the dominant country in Europe. But I think they will not take the final step towards becoming a federal state. And if you were to ask me where Europe would be in 20 years' time, I would say exactly where it is now, a completely unsatisfactory, unworkable halfway house, neither an association of sovereign states nor a sovereign state itself. It'll be a muddle, just as it is now. And everything you were saying about Corona bonds and the 535 billion package, I think it isn't all grants, by the way. It's a mixture of loans and grants. And the frugal four to whom you report, they haven't finished yet. They're going to water this down. And the idea that this is a Hamiltonian moment, as some people have said, towards the creation of the United States of Europe, I think it's more a Jeffersonian moment, which is not a leap towards a federal Europe. I think it's just yet another half measure that won't have a great deal of effect.
Yes, I often think of the EU as a sort of synthetic union without a demos, really.
Exactly.
And of course, we can see the inherent contradiction laid bare for the world to see of having a common currency without a common government to back it up. But I can imagine the federalists, the Euro federalists, looking at some of the opposition to federalism and seeing what has happened during the crisis and say, look, it's because national politicians had to answer to national electorates that we've had this. Wouldn't it be so much easier if we had common European politicians, pan-European politicians answering to a pan-European electorate, and perhaps seeing the bailout as a stepping stone towards greater federalism? Do you really think the EU can muddle on, or do you think eventually it will have to there'll have to be a kind of a decision made about whether they go towards full integration or whether indeed the bloc starts to disintegrate somewhat and maybe splinter off into 2 or 3 different parts?
Well, I'm inclined to think muddle will prevail. One talks about, will the Federalists get on top of it? But, these things ebb and flow. I mean, when I was Chancellor of the Exchequer, the most federalist country in Europe was Holland. Then Holland suddenly became Eurosceptic. Now it's going back to being almost, well, not quite federalist again, but more pro-European again. People come and go, parties come and go. I mean, you've had similar fluctuations in Finland. I think unless Europe was able to demonstrate very clearly to the population of Europe that the European Union was solving some problem that only could be solved by Europe and not by national governments. That's the theory of Europe, but it's always been a theory. It's never worked in practice at all. And until the people of Europe began to believe that was the case, I don't see how you can move towards a federal Europe. And, again, another country that was, at the time I was Chancellor, passionately pro the single currency, passionately pro-federalism, was the Italians. And look
Absolutely.
how Italy today, is one of the most Eurosceptic countries there is. And my goodness, Mr. Salvini talks about the European Union in a way I wouldn't ever dream of talking about it. He's positively insulting about it. And I never would have thought the Italian public would have put up with that, but they have. And Salvini may well yet be the next Prime Minister of Italy.
Norman, do you think there's a risk, talking about Italy, do you think there's a risk of sovereign debt crises in Southern Europe?
Yes, I do. I've always marveled how the Italians have managed to get through so many debt crises. But I think there is a double risk. There's the level of indebtedness of Italy, which will obviously go much higher, just as the indebtedness of Britain will go much higher, but Italy's starting from a much higher point. And then there is always the devaluation risk, the risk that Italy might be forced out of the euro and therefore its debts would become more expensive and people would have less. It's the fear of that causes people to have less confidence in Italian euros.
And, Norman, we focus a lot of attention has gone on Southern Europe, but also Central and Eastern Europe, I think, is interesting. I see a bit of a new sort of cultural iron curtain that had already come down Europe, the spine of Europe, between what would be more liberal Western side of Europe and Central and Eastern Europe on the other hand. It seems as if the Visegrad group particularly are quite concerned about this bailout package. They think they may lose out from it. Assuming it does go ahead, even if in a watered down form, what do you think could be the implications in terms of relations between the likes of Poland and Hungary on the one hand and the French and the Germans on the other?
Well, I don't know a lot closely about Poland, but as you say, their attitude is driven partly by pure financial consideration. Are they going to lose out in these packages? But secondly, I think there's something deeper happening there, particularly in Hungary and Poland, and that is a cultural conservatism, which one may or may not approve of. And, there are lots of critics of Mr. Orban. I don't really wish to take sides on that, but that is creating a tension between some of those countries and the rest of Europe, and poses a real challenge to the European Union, because the European Union has set itself up as a champion of liberal values, and as many people see it, those values are being threatened by some of the political forces in Eastern Europe.
And they are very much on the EU naughty step. Do you see any possibility those countries may, and they seem increasingly semi-detached from the bloc, seem at the moment not particularly interested in joining the currency? Do you think there's a possibility they could in some way be pushed out or leave, especially if the money isn't flowing towards them? And what would the implications be for the EU if that happened?
Well, it's possible. I don't see any sign of that now. I think what happens to Britain with Brexit over the long term, like give it a decade or so, will have an influence on other countries' attitude to the EU. If Britain prospers in a spectacular way after Brexit, I can see people would say, well, what's this all about? What's this? Why remain if they had other reasons to be unhappy with the EU?
So, based on the fact, Norman, that the other countries in the EU and Eurozone will look to Brexit and see how that plays out, a cynic may argue that the Brussels elite of the EU actually would have a vested interest in Brexit going badly, and bad trading relations and bad geopolitical relations with Britain after December, just in order to make sure that others don't walk.
Well, it's possible. I'm sure some people in Europe have that view, and are deeply hostile to the whole idea of Brexit. But against that, they know that if they create structures that permanently damage Britain, they just damage themselves. And so I think one force is countered by another.
And Norman, penultimate question: the German Constitutional Court ruling against the ECB bond buying, what do you see as the implications of that?
It is quite dramatic, but I think one shouldn't go overboard about it. The Constitutional Court did not say that the ECB's bond buying was monetary financing, which some people thought they might. It made a more modified criticism, and the bond buying that they were criticizing was not the present round of bond buying, but a previous one, and they were saying it was not proportional, i.e. did not take account of side effects. What has been interesting about it is how the German government has rushed to try and reassure the court, and so has the ECB. They've gone to the court through Mr. Wiedmann, the president of the Bundesbank, to say, look, here are the minutes. We have taken account of the side effects. So actually Germany and the Bundesbank, rather ironically, because the Bundesbank is not very keen on this ECB bond buying, are trying to smooth over relations with the court, between the court and the ECB. So I think what we're going to see is a classic Euro fudge on this issue.
Norman, we've spoken about a lot today. We've spoken about the coronavirus crisis, Brexit, future trading relations for the UK, and the state of the EU and the Eurozone. Putting all of that together, if you had one broad prediction, broad forecast for the next 6 to 9 months, perhaps the rest of 2020, could be domestic, could be international, could be economic, could be political, what would that prediction or forecast be?
That forecast would be that the unexpected always happens and the inevitable never.
That seems a very thoughtful note on which to end. So, Lord Lamont, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. You can find out more at www.brexit-watch.org. You can find us on Facebook and on Twitter, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time.